I have so much to say to you today. I probably have 3 hours of talking to do in an hour, so I have to stay focused, and that's not easy for me to do. My name is Chad Tim. I'm a professor at Simpson College. I teach people to be teachers. I'm a former middle and high school history teacher in the Des Moines metro area, and probably my favorite student of all time is in the room today, which is kind of intimidating because it's been a few years, Mackenzie. But this story is one that I've been telling for 25 years. As a part of my master's thesis. I was starting my master's in history at Iowa State, and I have a master's degree in history and a PhD in the history of education from Iowa State. And my thesis advisor said, you need a thesis topic. You need to write a thesis for this master's degree. And he said, I heard that there were prisoners of war in Iowa during World War II. You should check that out. And I'm born and raised in Iowa. I had a degree in history from Simpson College, and I had been teaching for 4 or 5 years and had no idea that there were prisoners of war in Iowa during World War II. And I went to Clarinda and I interviewed families who had POWs on their farms during World War II. And I went to Algona and I interviewed folks in a retirement center who remember having POWs on their farms in the 1940s. And basically what I've done over the last 25 years is the folks in Clarinda have done a great job of preserving the story of prisoners of war in Clarinda from 1943 to 1946. And the folks in Algona have done a tremendous job, which I'll talk about them more, of preserving the history of the POW program in Algona. But up to that point in time, nobody had told the story of prisoners of war in Iowa from beginning to end. And in 2011, I wrote an article for the Annals of Iowa, which is an Iowa history journal, that basically tied the story of the two camps together into one story. And so if you just Google my name and if you Google prisoners of war in Iowa, you should go to it should take you to the Annals of Iowa website, and the PDF of the article that I wrote, it's about 40 pages, is free that you can download and you can access. So there's a lot more information there, and I'll probably be able to share with you today. But my goal today is basically to give you a sense of why prisoners of war came to Iowa, what their experience was like during the Second World War. And really there's two stories here. One story is a story of German and Italian prisoners of war. And then the second story is a story of Japanese prisoners of war, because there were only 2 camps in the United States that housed Japanese prisoners. And one of them was in Clarinda, Iowa. Are you ready? We ready for this? Okay. So here's what happens. When the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the United States declares war on Japan, and then Germany declares war on the United States. And I see some familiar faces. I think maybe there's some folks here who have been to this presentation before. I'll try to add some information that I didn't the last time. But when the Germans declare war on the United States, that is significant. Of course, the Japanese and the Germans had this secret pact. But when Germany declares war on the United States, it gives President Franklin Roosevelt a choice. Are we going to focus the majority of our attention in this effort in the Pacific against the Japanese, or are we going to also spread some of that focus and effort on the war in Europe? And President Roosevelt was getting a tremendous amount of pressure from Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, who was basically fighting this war by themselves on the Eastern Front. Remember that by 1942, the Battle of Dunkirk has taken place. The British forces have been kicked off the continent of Europe, and the Battle of Britain is being waged. And so Churchill and Stalin put pressure on Roosevelt to focus our attention on establishing a second front in Europe, to help divert some of that attention from the Battle of Britain and from the war that's being taken place in the East. And so after a lot of negotiation, President Franklin Roosevelt agrees. And of course, we're going to fight this war in the South Pacific from 1942 until 1945. There's no doubt about that. But we do focus a tremendous amount of attention on Europe, and we try to establish a second front. The first attempt at establishing a second front occurs in North Africa. And North Africa matters for this story because during the North Africa campaign, the Allies took more German and Italian prisoners than in the 3 years of the war prior to that combined. And Britain had nowhere to put them. And so Winston Churchill told Franklin Roosevelt, you've got thousands of naval vessels and merchant marine vessels sailing across the Atlantic Ocean from the United States to Europe, full of weapons, materials, and supplies, and then they're sailing back to the United States empty. Why don't we just fill them up with German and Italian prisoners? And it was a longer conversation than that and some negotiation. But ultimately, we agreed. And by late 1942, early 1943, there were about 50 prisoner of war camps in the United States with about 500 German and Italian prisoners of war. And by 1945, there were 500 prisoner of war camps and more than 375,000 German and Japanese prisoners of war in the United States. And of course, 2 of those camps come to Iowa. And so one question that I get asked quite often is, why would these prisoner of war camps come to Iowa? Of those 500 camps spread across the United States of America, 2 of those camps come to Iowa. And, I've been to the National Archives. I have been looking for a box of documents that would give the definitive answer to that question, and it just doesn't exist. Most of the information about the prisoner of war camps was classified, and a lot of that information was destroyed, and a lot of that information was redacted. And so in terms of finding the capital T truth as to why prisoners of war come to Iowa, it's difficult to say. I have a couple of theories. One of those theories is that the chair of the Senate Agricultural Committee, the highest ranking member of the United States Senate, was Guy Gillette, who was one of Iowa's 2 senators. And Guy Gillette, as the chair of the Senate Agricultural Committee, by 1943, I believe, knew that prisoners of war were being used as laborers in various parts of the United States. And so I think that might be one reason why Iowans learned about prisoners of war, is because we're going to have a significant farm labor shortage in Iowa during the Second World War, and I'm going to get to that in just one second. And maybe we should keep track of how many times Chad says I'm going to get to that, and we'll see if I actually get to those things. So that's one reason. I think Guy Gillette knew that in Louisiana in early 1943, German prisoners of war were helping to harvest sugarcane. And in 1942, Iowans were being asked to do more by the War Food Administration, to grow more, to plant more, to harvest more than ever before. And by the end of 1943, 75,000 Iowans between the ages of 18 and 25 have been drafted to fight in the war. Many of those 18 to 25-year-old young men would have worked as farm laborers at some point in time in the spring or fall planting or harvesting season, or detasseling in the summer. So that's one reason. Another reason, and it's on the screen, is Henry Wallace. From 1936 until 1943, Pioneer utilized migrant farm workers in the summer to detassel. This was part of a program created by Franklin Roosevelt called the Bracero Program, where migrant farm workers, most of them Mexican migrant farm workers, were hired by companies, large companies like Pioneer and DeKalb, and they were used as farm laborers in the summer. Well, Iowa wasn't the only state that was facing a farm labor shortage in 1943, because we're ultimately going to have more than 8 million men and women serving overseas. Many of them would have been available as farm laborers. And so in the summer of 1943, Pioneer could not get access to migrant farm workers to do their summer detasseling. And so Pioneer used Italian prisoners of war. How did Pioneer learn that Italian prisoners of war might be available as farm laborers? I can only assume that the Vice President of the United States of America, Henry Wallace, who founded Pioneer, might have had something to do with Pioneer knowing about the possibility of using Italian prisoners. I don't have evidence of that, but more than once in my presentation today, I'm going to tell you a story that I wish were true, and we're just going to pretend like it is. And that's one of them. So, this quote is significant. This is from the Algona Upper Des Moines, and I'm sorry if I feel like I'm yelling, but I'm trying to make sure that Alyssa, you can hear me back there? Okay. By 1942, this is a quote from the Algona Upper Des Moines, and I'm going to have some quotes on the screen, and I'll make sure I read them to you, because I know back in the back it might be hard to see, but it says, "It begins to look like the Army boys may have to fight on empty stomachs." As I said, the War Food Administration asked Iowa farmers to do more, to grow more, and I have read those reports. The War Food Administration described the farmland in north central Iowa especially as some of the richest and most fertile in the world. Not in the United States and not in Iowa, but in the world. And as a result, they asked Iowans to do more. And for example, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also attacked dozens and dozens of islands in the South Pacific that the United States supervised, and that cut off access to significant supplies for us. For example, when the Japanese spread their influence in the South Pacific, we lost access to the vast majority of our sugar cane. And so Iowa farmers were asked to grow sugar beets, and we opened sugar beet processing plants, and those sugar beets were turned into sugar in Iowa. Also, we lost access to the majority of our sisal rope. The rope that was used, the big, massive rope that was used in the Merchant Marine Force we lost access to that in the South Pacific. And so Iowa farmers grew hemp. And that hemp was processed in hemp mills like in Traer, Iowa, and that hemp was made into rope. Well, how are we going to be able to do what the government is asking us to do if most farmers in Page County and Fremont County in southwestern Iowa and in Kossuth County in north central Iowa at some point in time during the spring planting season, the summer detasseling season, or the fall harvesting season relied on farm labor? And the majority of those available farm laborers were drafted. And so we were concerned that we would not be able to do what the government was asking us to do because we didn't have the resources necessary. There are 1,000 stories I could tell that I won't. Here is one that in the winter of 1942 into the 1943, so December of 43 into January of 42 to 43, sorry. The Clarinda Herald-Journal reported that by March there was still corn standing in many farmers' fields that hadn't been harvested in the fall. And there were farmers who were coming together, ranging in ages from 5 to 75, who were shucking corn in knee-deep snow in early March of 1943. They did not have the labor that they needed to get the work done when they needed to get it done. And so that's where this quote is coming from. When I give this presentation to high school students, and I'll talk about this to anybody who wants me to talk to them about it. I always tell them, I said, when I was a kid, and maybe when Mackenzie was a student, we had these things that we would lay out and look at and help us get where we're going. We call them maps. I might have aged you a little bit. Certainly aged myself. So I tell them to get out your phones and find these two places. But north central Iowa, Camp Algona is one of the two main camps, and in southwestern Iowa, in Page County, Camp Clarinda. Now on this map, there are a number of little hearts. Those are places where there were smaller branch camps, and I'm going to talk about those camps moving forward. That's the second time I told you I was going to talk about something. Now, the very first POWs that come to Iowa, this is before we have a prisoner of war camp. The prisoner of war camps, by the way, are going to be completed in January of 1944. But in 1943, as I had mentioned to you, Pioneer had a hard time finding labor to do some of the work that they needed done in the summer detasseling season. And so Pioneer, in 1943, contracted with the United States government and brought 300 Italian prisoners of war from a camp in Missouri to Iowa. And those 300 Italian prisoners of war worked for Pioneer all over the state. Some of them worked in Traer, Iowa, at that hemp mill that I told you about, and they processed hemp in Traer. Now, a couple times during this presentation, I'm going to quote myself, which is really pretentious. But this is from that article I told you about, and there are details that I don't want to miss, and so I'm going to read those details to you. So in the summer of 1943, Italian prisoners of war, some of the work they did was on the Adams Ranch in Sac County near Odebolt. The Adams Ranch is the largest ranch in the state of Iowa, 6,400 acres. And Italian POWs in the summer of 1943, this is what they did. The largest farm in the state had 2,800 acres of corn, 270 acres of flax, 685 acres of oats, and 1,065 acres in tame hay, 1,040 acres of red clover, and 10 acres of potatoes, with the remaining acres in pasture. After several attempts to secure migrant farm workers had failed, the Italian POWs were brought in to shock and thresh 2,100 acres of grain that otherwise would have rotted in the fields. Another 200 Italian prisoners of war worked for 2 months in a hemp plant near Eldora, Iowa in late 1943. Although these POWs imported from neighboring states alleviated a few specific labor problems, the farm labor emergency issue in Iowa was just beginning. So, out of nowhere, we have these POWs in Iowa in 1943 during the summer. And in August of 1943, folks in Clarinda and folks in Algona found out that POW camps were coming to their communities. And this felt, to the people of Clarinda and to the people of Algona, this felt like it came out of nowhere. I have been to the State Historical Library, and I have read the microfilm copies of those newspapers. And literally on a Tuesday, there was nothing about prisoners of war. And on a Thursday, the headline was POW camps coming to town. And as I said, how might this have happened? I kind of told you my theories that either Guy Gillette or Henry Wallace, but there were also local members of the Chambers of Commerce in Clarinda and Algona that had friends in communities in Nebraska. Nebraska had POW camps and Missouri had POW camps by this time. And POW camps cost a lot of money to build. $1 million in 1943 to build the POW camp. And the image that I have on the screen here is an aerial view of Camp Algona. And Camp Clarinda looked exactly the same because the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built the camps on the same architectural plans. That way they could get these camps up and running quickly. And it cost $1 million to build this camp in 1943. And the camp would have 500 American troops and 2,500 enemy prisoners of war. And all of the concrete and the carpentry and the electrical that would be necessary to run those camps was going to mean people earning money and getting contracts to build those camps. And so in some ways, these POW camps brought a tremendous amount of revenue into these communities. I mean, Clarinda and Algona, both of those communities had about 5,000 people in 1943. So 5,000 people living in Clarinda, and now we've got 500 American troops and 2,500 German prisoners of war, and the camp itself is going to double the size of the community. And so there were other communities in Iowa, and this is where I am in the weeds in this story, and I've got to stop. Sorry, but one more side story. There were other communities in Iowa that submitted contracts because they wanted POW camp. They wanted a camp. One of them was in Toledo. In Toledo, Iowa, they submitted a proposal to the United States government to build a prisoner of war camp in Toledo in an old button factory that was owned by the Meskwaki people in Toledo. The U.S. government sent representatives. The representatives checked out the site, and they determined that it was not suitable to have a POW camp that close to town. And so Toledo's proposal was rejected. Later, Toledo would have a branch camp, and that's another story that I might get to. That's the third time. This is the photograph of the front gates of Camp Algona. So here's what happens. In August of 1943, the people of Clarinda and Algona find out that POW camp is coming to town. Each of the camps is going to be about a mile outside of town. Let me tell you about the POW camps. About a mile outside of town, each one of them. The POW camp in Algona, there were 3 family farms. One of them was a heritage farm, and the government acquired the land through eminent domain. The farmers were not happy that they had to give up their property. They were compensated for it, but they did not want to give up the land, and they did. And they didn't have a choice in it. And so what that means is that there's a lot of apprehension. There's a lot of nervousness. It's difficult for me when I talk to 18-year-olds or 17-year-olds about this to impress upon them how you might have felt about this. I used to talk about 9/11. I used to say, imagine that in 2005, we find out that they are going to put members of Al-Qaeda who were responsible for the 9/11 attacks just outside of town. And how would you feel? Now, I can't do that anymore because when I say that to young people that were born in 2006, they can't necessarily make that immediate connection. But the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. The Bataan Death March has taken place where 17,000 American soldiers were marched or tortured to death by the Japanese. We are fighting this war in Europe, and now, next thing you know, the enemy is coming to town. Each of these camps, once completed, could house up to 2,500 prisoners of war and 500 American troops in approximately 186 buildings. The buildings were set on concrete foundations and composed of wood frames covered by composition siding and roofing with interior walls made of plasterboard. Each camp consisted of 4 compounds, 3 for prisoners of war, the 4th for an American garrison. Barbed wire fence with towers manned by machine gunners at each corner separated 3 prisoner compounds with 20 frame barracks, each housing 50 men. Once completed, both camps included a post theater, church, fire station, ice house, machine shop, barn, hospital, electric distribution system, and water and sewage facilities. When I gave this talk in Algona years ago, folks told me that the water facilities and the sewage facilities at the camp were better than what they had in town, and they weren't thrilled about that either. This is an article from the Red Oak Express from December of 1943, and it says, the garb of the prisoner of war becomes of interest to Iowans due to the December 15th activation of the prisoner camp in Clarinda. A U.S. Army officer poses in these pictures to show Iowans what the work uniforms of the prisoner of war looks like. The letters PW, prisoner of war, are conspicuously marked on coats, shirts, blouses, and jackets of the work uniforms, but not on national uniforms of officer prisoners and prisoner enlisted men. Escapes are rare, but military authorities ask any person observing a suspicious individual or prowler wearing a PW outer garment or any part of a German uniform to collect the telephone operator at Clarinda. So that's what you need to do if you happen to see somebody in a PW costume or in a German uniform. Just collect the operator at Camp Clarinda. Okay, in the early 2000s, goodness gracious, in about 2001, I went to Clarinda and I interviewed 3 women, Vera Wellhausen and Dorothy Johnson, with their husbands, employed German prisoners of war in 1944, 1945. And then I interviewed a woman named Corinne Gerker, and Corinne Gerker was 18 years old in 1944, and she was the camp commander's private secretary. And when I interviewed Corinne, I said, how did your parents, being 17, 18, how did your parents feel about these German prisoners of war coming to town? And Corinne said, my parents were more worried about the 500 U.S. GIs than they were about the German prisoners of war. As you could imagine. And I clicked too many. When the camps, so in Camp Clarinda, the initial camp commander's name was Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Lobdell, and Lobdell was in public relations prior to the war. And between August and January of 1943 to 1944, Arthur Lobdell masterfully waged a public relations campaign to prepare the people of Clarinda for the camp. He wrote weekly editorials explaining what was happening, how the construction was progressing, and then in January of 1944, he opened the gates of the camp and encouraged Clarindans to drive out to the camp and drive around and see what it looked like. And in the process of doing that, Lobdell connected the community to the camp. He alleviated a lot of those suspicions. I mean, remember in 1943, there is no internet, and you can't get on Google Earth to zoom in and see what's going on over at the POW camp. And so it was natural for young people and old people alike to want to see what was going on out there. And so they would go out there and snoop. And once the camp opened and was in operation, guards were ordered to shoot anyone around the wire. And that did not happen, fortunately, in Iowa, but there are other cases in the United States where civilians were shot at and were shot snooping around barbed wire camps, and which is pretty tragic. So Lobdell, by inviting the people of the community out to the camp, really alleviated some of those uncertainties and apprehensions. And as a result, in January of 1944, when the camp opened, it opened and it was functioning smooth and was running smoothly. Now, that did not happen in Algona. When Camp Algona opened in January of 1944, there was a lot of resistance among the German POWs. And this is something that not everybody is aware of, but not all German soldiers were members of the National Socialist Party. Not all German soldiers were members of the Nazi Party. Most German soldiers that came to Camp Clarinda or Algona were drafted to fight a war, like our young men were drafted to fight a war. And those first German POWs, and by the way, I should say that we didn't have any Italian POWs at Algona or Clarinda, because in 1943, Italy was defeated, Mussolini was deposed, and Italy became an ally, which put us in an awkward situation because we had 30,000 Italian prisoners of war in the United States, and now they are our allies. And so we gave those Italian POWs a choice. We said, we could either send you back to Europe, where you could fight as an ally, or you could stay here in the United States and become a part of what we called Italian service units. And those Italian service units would travel around to camps under construction to make sure that the camps were ready for the next group of POWs to come in. And so most of those Italian POWs stayed in the United States. Back to the German POWs. Not all Nazis. Those first German POWs that came to Algona and Clarinda from North Africa, they ranged in age from 14 to 70. I mean, the Germans were giving everybody, putting a rifle in anybody's hand who could carry them. Some of those German POWs were not German. They were Polish. They had been taken prisoner by the Germans and told that you could either die or you could fight for Germany. And they fought for Germany and were captured and were brought to the United States. If we noticed if we identified German POWs as Nazis, we tried to send them to one camp in Oklahoma because those Nazi soldiers were instructed to disrupt and to prevent the POW camps from operating smoothly. And that's what happened in Algona. There were about 30 of these hardcore Nazis in Algona, and when the camp opened, they refused to comply. They refused to obey. They refused to work. And Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Lobdell was transferred from Camp Clarinda to Camp Algona to get Camp Algona in shape. And he was replaced by a man named Lieutenant Colonel George Ball. And so when Lobdell went to Algona, he identified who those 30 hardcore Nazi POWs were. He put them in solitary confinement on bread and water diets until they would comply. Some of them lasted 18 or 19 days before they decided to cooperate. And then ultimately, Camp Algona was running smoothly after that. There's a historian in Iowa named Michael Luke Trams, Luick-Trams. He is fluent in German, and he has written a book where he has translated the POW newspaper. The German POWs in Algona had their own camp paper. And there are two series, 1944 and 1945. And the 1944 German language POW paper in Algona is very much pro-Nazi. There are swastikas, there's Heil Hitlers, and it was very pro-Nazi in 1944. That same POW newspaper in 1945 was very pro-West, pro-democracy, pro-capitalism. And part of that is because of Lobdell's influence, and part of that is because we have what we call the re-education program at Camp Clarinda and Camp Algona, where German POWs took classes on the benefits of democracy and capitalism in the hopes that when they went back to Germany, they would spread the good news about the benefits of democracy and capitalism. Okay. We knew, we being the United States government, knew that we had to keep these POWs busy, and if we didn't keep them busy, then there could be problems. And so one of the ways that we kept them busy was that the 1929 Geneva Convention specified some pretty specific rules on how countries should treat enemy combatants, prisoners of war. We signed the Geneva Convention. Germany signed the Geneva Convention. Japan did not sign the Geneva Convention, and that's a story that I'll get to in a little bit. But by signing the Geneva Convention, we agreed to comply with it. And the Geneva Convention said that you could require enemy enlisted men to work, but you had to pay them for their labor. And at Camp Algona and Camp Clarinda, German POWs did work. If they worked at the campsite, they earned 10 cents a day. They worked in the camp canteen, they worked in the kitchen, they worked in a garden. Each of these camps had about an 80-acre garden where they grew a lot of their own vegetables. Those POWs could either have that 10 cents a day put into like a savings bond that they could liquidate when they were repatriated, and some of them did. Most of them, however, exchanged what they earned for camp canteen coupons, little coupons that I've got a picture of, and they could go to the camp canteen and they could purchase playing cards, they could purchase chess sets, they could purchase tobacco, they could purchase paint and pen and pencil. And so in the camp canteen, this is a painting that was painted by a German POW. This is in the museum at Algona, and I'll say this again probably, but if you get the chance to go to Algona, they have a wonderful museum there, and you should go and see it. I'll talk more about it in a minute, but this is a painting that was painted by a German POW, and it's at Camp Algona in Algona, Iowa. This is another painting. It depicts American troops in a field supervising German prisoners of war who are working in that field. This is a German POW who carved the nativity scene and gifted that nativity scene to the people of Algona, and it's there. If you go to Algona now, did you get to see the nativity scene? Okay. Yeah, it's still there. As the story goes, in the winter of 1944 into 1945, in the Christmas season, German POWs would sing Christmas songs in German, and The barracks, the POW barracks were very close to the American barracks. And the American guards heard German POWs singing these Christmas songs in German, and so the American guards would sing Christmas songs in English, and they basically would serenade each other. And this German POW was so moved by how he was treated at Camp Algona and how he was treated by the people of Algona that he decided to carve this nativity scene, and he left it to the people of Algona as a gift when he was repatriated and went back to Germany. His name was Edward Kaib, and this is a picture of the nativity scene. A few years ago, I think it was around COVID time, there was a movie made about this called, I think, Silent Night, Camp Algona or something like that. Does that sound right? I think if you get on YouTube and you searched for Camp Algona, Silent Night, you can actually rent the movie on YouTube. And I remember this because it was around COVID time, and they had a call for extras. Is that what you call it? For extras to serve in the movie, and they were making the movie around the time that COVID broke out. This is an article from the Clarinda Herald-Journal. It says that soccer, a sport which is considered Europe's football, is proving popular at Clarinda in the prisoner of war camp. Evenings, people of Clarinda hear rousing cheers and have learned from POW officers that it comes from the prisoners who are playing their favorite sport. Another outdoor game is similar to tennis. The racket is long-handled like badminton. The net is high, but those who have watched it compare it with tennis. And for indoor sports, officers of the camp point out German prisoners spend most of their time at chess. This is a photograph of some of those camp canteen coupons. So you would work for 10 cents a day, exchange that earning for a coupon, and then you could exchange the coupon at the camp canteen. When I interviewed Corinne Gerker, the camp commander's private secretary, in the early 2000s, she told me a story. She said that in the very beginning, remember that there was a lot of rationing during World War II, where you couldn't get certain items because they were being rationed. I mean, gasoline was rationed. The Clarinda Herald-Journal constantly told people, don't drive out and try to look at the camp. You're just wasting gas. Gasoline was rationed. Rubber was rationed because we were using a lot of that fuel and the rubber for our war effort. We also rationed Hershey's chocolate, and packages of cigarettes were rationed, and canned beer was rationed as well. And part of the reason for that was because we were sending care packages to American servicemen that comprised of Hershey's chocolate, packets of cigarettes, and cans of beer. And both my grandpas served in World War II. My grandpa, Bill McNamara, who graduated from East High School when he was 17 and convinced his mom, in Des Moines, to let him enlist as a 17-year-old in the Marine Corps, and eventually fought at Iwo Jima. My grandpa Bill told me that he learned how to drink and smoke in the Marine Corps, as you can imagine. and from care packages of Hershey's chocolate, cigarettes and beer. Well, Corinne told me that in the very beginning when the camp opened, German POWs could go to the camp canteen and exchange their coupons for Hershey's chocolate and canned beer. And when the people in Clarinda found out that German POWs were drinking beer and eating Hershey's chocolate, they were not happy because it was rationed. And so they put a stop to that. And I asked Corinne, I said, well, how did the Germans respond? And she said they didn't care much because they thought the beer was too weak. And she told me that the German POWs would hoard fruit rinds, and they had stills in their barracks, and they were making schnapps in their barracks, which was against camp policies, but because they never caused any problems, they allowed them to do it. Okay, so the heart of the story, I'm already halfway done, and I'm just getting to the point, which shouldn't be a surprise to some of you. But the real heart of the story is that the German prisoners of war, and then the Japanese later, are going to provide really an irreplaceable source of labor for farmers in Iowa during World War II. And as I had said, the War Food Administration established goals. They didn't call them quotas, they called them goals. And every year from 1942 to 1945, the goals for Iowa farmers was increased. Grow more, plant more, harvest more. And we were asked to do that with fewer resources. And so as I had mentioned, the Geneva Convention specified that if POWs worked on the camp, they would earn 10 cents a day. If they worked outside of the camp, they would earn 80 cents a day. And so many POWs agreed to work outside the camp because they earned 80 cents a day for the work that they provided. But if you wanted to employ POWs on your farm, then you had to pay the government to do it. It wasn't free labor. There were concerns in many communities in Iowa, like in Waterloo, for example, and in Charles City, that people could just basically have quote-unquote slave labor. You don't have to pay these POWs, and they can work for you. And why would you hire an Iowan for 60 cents an hour when you could just use a German POW for nothing? And so as a result, if Iowans were going to utilize German POWs, they had to pay the going rate for their labor. And the going rate for farm labor in 1944 was 60 cents an hour. And so the farmer would pay the government 60 cents an hour. The government would pay the POW 80 cents a day. And this is where I tell you that I'm a historian and not an economist. But if the POW is earning 80 cents a day and the farmer is paying the government 60 cents an hour, then the government is making quite a bit of money off the POW labor program. And by the end of the war, farmers in Iowa had paid more than $3.5 million in wages to German POWs, to the government, for the operations at Camp Clarinda. Now, of course, the camp didn't run for free, but you get my point. The problem, however, is this. Early on in the POW labor program, the rules said that you needed to request 10 or more POWs. And so what you would do is you would call the camp and you would say, I need 15 POWs. I'm going to pick them up on Thursday. You would drive to the camp and load them up, and with an American Guard, because an American Guard had to see them, had to be within a mile of the POWs and had to see them every hour, and then you would take them to your farm. Most farmers in Page and Fremont County and in Kasuth County did not need 10 additional farm laborers. Most farmers in Page and Fremont County and in Kasuth maybe needed 1 or 2 guys to help them in the busiest part of their season. If you did not need 10 or more, you could not participate. And so in March and April of 1944, the camp is opened, the spring planting season has begun, and farmers in southwestern Iowa, north central Iowa, do not have the help that they need, even though the help is in town or just outside of town, because of the way that the government policy was written. And so in my research, I kept coming across the names in local newspapers of county extension agents. Each county in Iowa had an extension agent, and those extension agents wrote reports. And so I went to the Parks Library on the 2nd floor, Special Collections at Iowa State University in Ames, and I found all of the bound volumes of extension agent reports from all 99 counties. And each of those extension agents wrote about what they did. And what I found was that in Page and Fremont County and in Kasuth County, the county extension agent created an emergency farm labor association. I'm going to use air quotes, an emergency farm labor association. The Farm Labor Association got money from local farmers and reserved a pool of POWs, more than 10, that the individual farmers could draw from. So if you needed 3 POWs, you couldn't get 3 because you had to have 10 or more. The Farm Labor Association requested 30, and you drew 3 from the 30 that they requested. It sounds silly, but it's bureaucracy. It was the government policy, and the way to get around the policy was to be innovative and to use ingenuity, and those county extension agents did. And so by March of 1944, for the first time, POWs are leaving Camp Algona and Camp Clarinda and are going out and working with Iowa farmers. I know these pictures are far away. I can share the slides with Alyssa, but this shows a German POW on the left-hand side. He is harvesting sugar beets. And then it shows 2 POWs on the right-hand side. This is a group of German POWs that were shucking corn. These are also German POWs. Sometimes I have, middle-aged dad humor, and when I'm talking to high school students, I'll say, which one of these is not a German POW? And they'll look at it, and they'll pick somebody. They're all German POWs. And that part of the funny joke, that's not really that funny, is that when folks in Clarinda and folks in Algona brought these German POWs to their farm, they saw their brothers and their sons and their uncles and their cousins, both in Page and Fremont County and in Kasuth County. These are heavy German American communities. I interviewed people in Algona who told me that in the 1930s they were still speaking German in their Lutheran churches in Kossuth County. There were farmers in Kossuth County who could speak German to the German POWs. That is not the case with the Japanese, by the way. I'm getting there. But at least for the German POWs, Iowa farmers looked into the eyes of those enemy soldiers and they saw themselves. There are so many stories that I could tell. Maybe I'll come back in a couple of years. But there's one of my favorite stories is I was giving this presentation in Waverly, Iowa, and a gentleman comes up to me afterwards and told me that his uncle was an immigrant from Germany and farmed in Kossuth County during the war. His brother did not come with him. His brother was drafted in the German army. And during the Second World War, his brother was taken prisoner. Maybe you know where I'm going with this story. His brother was held captive at Camp Algona. He was farming in Kossuth County. He was notified that his brother was a prisoner of war at Camp Algona, and they were unified. They were joined. They were reunited is the word. And that's just not normal. This seems pretty odd. German POWs play catch with children in the fields. They oftentimes ate lunch at the tables with the farmers who were employing them. When I was in Clarinda, someone told me a story that one of the American guards came to check on a German POW who was in the home of the farmer, and they were sitting at the table and they were eating lunch, and the American guard didn't think it was appropriate that the POW was at the table, and the farmer told him, well, then you can leave and let us finish our lunch. There were no escape attempts by German POWs at Camp Clarinda. Zero. The closest to an escape attempt wasn't really an escape attempt, but a Clarindan, a Page County farmer, got in trouble because he took a POW who was working for him to lunch on the square at a cafe. And people were walking by the cafe and saw a German soldier eating lunch at the cafe. And they weren't allowed to do that. And so that farmer got reprimanded. But the best way to describe the relationship that developed between Iowa farmers and German POWs between 1944 to 1945 was just that they developed friendships. Some of them lasted a lifetime. And as a result, in 1944, the farm labor program was incredibly successful in Page and Fremont County. And I say Page and Fremont County because Clarinda is in Page County and Shenandoah is in Fremont County, and there's like 15 miles between the two of them, and a lot of POW labor was used in both Page and Fremont County. They did so much. They actually, in Charles City, a housing contractor paid the government and used POWs to build a series of houses in Charles City at a branch camp that was there. And those houses are still around. When I gave this talk in Charles City, and a gentleman came up to me afterwards, it's not always a gentleman, but the last two stories have been, came up to me afterwards and said, when I was a kid, I remember a German POW came and stayed with us for 2 weeks. The POW was supposed to go back to the branch camp, which was at the fairgrounds, enclosed in barbed wire, but instead of going back to the fairgrounds each night, the POW just stayed with them in their home for 2 weeks, which wasn't allowed, but things like that happen all the time. Okay, speaking of branch camps, if you did not live within 30 miles of a POW camp, I've got to speed up. If you didn't live within 30 miles of a POW camp, it didn't make sense to employ a prisoner of war for labor because you'd waste more money in gas getting there than you would save in having POW labor. And so the commander of the 7th Service Command, which was in charge of all the POW programs in the Midwest, issued a directive for camp commanders to begin building smaller branch camps. And so in Iowa, for example, this is a map that was on the wall of Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Lobdell in his office at Camp Algona. And the map depicts Algona as the base camp in the middle. And you can see Algona there in the center. And each of these squares is a community where there was a branch camp, a smaller camp that had between 50 to 350 POWs. And each of those squares has a calendar. And the calendar has squares that are blacked out. Those are the months in the year where POWs were in that community. And so you can see just from Camp Algona, there were POWs in Storm Lake, Ottawa, Tabor, Shenandoah, Eldora, Charles City, Waverly, Toledo, Muscatine, and Clinton. And of course, in southern Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and also, not Nebraska, not Wisconsin. Although there were POWs in Nebraska, Wisconsin, just not from Camp Algona. And so, for example, in Eldora, Iowa, German POWs were housed at Pine Lake, at the Hardin County Fairgrounds. If you've ever been to Pine Lake, if you've ever been to Hardin County Fairgrounds. During the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt created the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. It was a New Deal program that gave young men jobs to do conservation projects in the summer, and they lived there. Those buildings still existed. And so in Eldora at the Hardin County Fairgrounds, the CCC camp buildings were still there, and so they put barbed wire around them, and they had a few dozen German POWs live there in the summer of 1944. And if you go to Pine Lake now, there is, to my knowledge, the only building that is, well, not the only, yeah, it is, the only building that I'm aware of that is still standing where German prisoners of war lived for the better part of a year in 1944. They have a museum there, and the building is still there. So, yeah. This is a quote from Richard Norton. He said, "My father had hired a group of them to pull cockleburs in the bean fields. The guard I discovered when I took some cold soft drinks out to them was asleep between the bean rows." Albert Wellhausen said they were mostly good workers, and he considered one in particular the best laborer he had ever employed. Dorothy Johnson recalled an occasion when her husband was forced to leave home and tend to a sick relative, and rather than fear for the welfare of the farm, he said, "Bruno will know what to do." Bruno was a German POW who had spent the better part of a year working on the Johnson's farm. And this is my favorite story of Bruno. One day Bruno, he spoke very little English, and the Johnsons spoke very little German, but they communicated well with Bruno. Bruno came in from the field, and he was driving Dorothy's husband's truck, and he told them that he had seen a lot of pheasant and a lot of rabbit, a lot of game out in the field where he was working. And Dorothy's husband said, "Well, behind the seat there's a shotgun, and the next time you see game, you should, shoot it." And Bruno did. And it's kind of odd to imagine a German soldier in captivity hunting pheasant in a field in Page County, Iowa, but he did. Bruno, when the war ended, Bruno went back to Germany, and his community was devastated. Remember, economically, infrastructure, Germany was absolutely destroyed as a result of this war. And Bruno wrote a letter to the Johnson family and told them that his family was starving. And the Johnsons sent him $500. And he wrote another letter of thanks, but said that they were still struggling, and they sent him another bond or another check, treasury note or whatever it was for $500. And by the time they were done, they had sent Bruno more than $2,000 to help his family get through those tough years after the war. In the 1980s, a group of German POWs came back to Iowa, and they toured the state and visited a lot of the sites that they had stayed in. And Bruno was reunited with the Johnson family, and he paid them back the $2,000 that they had sent him to help his family get through those times. So that is how kind of deep and personal these relationships, many of them developed between Iowa farm families and German POWs. Not everybody was happy. I don't want to paint a story that everybody loved the fact that POWs were here. This is an Algona native who was fighting overseas. He found out how the German POWs were being treated, and he was fighting the Germans in Europe. He sent a letter to the editor, and he said that, "To me, it doesn't make sense that a Nazi kills 20 of our boys and then gives up and goes to the United States to be treated like some American fighting man with a few privileges taken away." So I do want to point out that not everybody was thrilled that the German POWs were here or that we were treating them well. But really, at the end of the day, Iowans were told by the government, and I think they believed this, that if they treated German POWs poorly and the Germans found out about it, then they would retaliate on American POWs. And there were hundreds of Iowans in POW camps at the time that Germans were being held in Iowa. And they believed it. They believed that if they treated the German POWs poorly, that their sons and brothers and uncles and cousins would have been treated poorly in Germany. And if you've read Stephen Ambrose's Citizen Soldiers, Stephen Ambrose is the historian that wrote D-Day, and he was a historical consultant on the movie Saving Private Ryan, and he wrote a book called Citizen Soldiers. Ambrose recounts stories of German POWs surrendering with very little resistance to American troops after the Normandy invasion, and telling American soldiers that they had friends who were in POW camps in the United States and they wanted to go to the United States. And so they surrendered. I guess there's one more example. This is the folks in Algona were not happy with the German POWs swimming in their pool. So that because of the many objections filed by Algona citizens, the city council will deny the prisoners of war at the camp here the use of the swimming pool in the future. 80 prisoners were permitted to use the pool a week ago Sunday, paying their way as do other pool patrons. Objections made by citizens contain such reasons as the prisoners being unclean, physically unfit to enter the water, and that it wasn't right that the pool should be contaminated by Nazis. At the present writing, Algona has 5 prisoners of war in Germany. Perhaps the civil population there holds the same reaction against those 5 Algona lads as our citizens hold against the prisoners in the local camp. Okay. That is the story of German POWs, and it's 10:53. I've got 7 minutes. I'm going to give you plenty of time to ask questions. So here's where we are. The 1944 farm labor season was incredibly successful. POWs in Page and Fremont counties in southwestern Iowa and in Kossuth County in north central Iowa provided invaluable support and help with our farm labor program. Also, at more than a dozen other locations across the state, from Toledo and Eldora to Charles City and Ottawa, POWs did other kinds of work. As a matter of fact, in 1944, there was a once-in-a-century, I say this ironically, there was a once-in-a-century flooding of the Missouri River in 1944. Massive flooding. German POWs helped repair breaks in the levee along the Missouri River. I gave this talk in Clarinda in 2019 when there was a one-in-a-century flood of the Missouri River. You remember 2019? The Missouri River flooded again, and folks in that community were struggling. We have a lot of once-in-a-century floods within 70 years, but it was hard to give this talk in Clarinda because there were folks there who were suffering from the effects of the Missouri River flooding, and in 1944 the Missouri River had flooded there as well. In January of 1945, the folks in Clarinda find out that all the German POWs are leaving and they're going to be replaced by Japanese prisoners of war. And that is a problem because the folks in Clarinda and Shenandoah, Page and Fremont counties, did not look into the eyes of Japanese POWs and see their brothers and their cousins and their sons. And with very little notice, the folks in Clarinda were notified that the Germans were leaving. They drove them around the square in trucks, and Dorothy Johnson told me that many people lined the streets and waved to the German POWs as they left, and some of them cried. The German POWs went to Camp Algona, and they were replaced by about 1,000 Japanese prisoners of war. This is the Clarinda Herald-Journal that says, Japs to replace Germans at local camp. 250 prisoners will be here to replace the Germans. And when I talked to my grandpa about this, about how he felt about the dropping of the atomic bombs and how he felt about the Japanese, my grandpa was thrilled that we dropped the atomic bombs. And as someone from a different generation, that bothered me, that my grandpa was thrilled that we dropped 2 atomic bombs and killed hundreds of thousands of people immediately, and millions more would be affected by toxic radioactive fallout. My grandpa was scheduled to invade Japan when we dropped the atomic bombs. And so for my grandpa, he was thrilled and had no remorse whatsoever. To my grandpa and his generation, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. It was a sneak attack that killed more than 2,000 Americans, and he hated the Japanese. And so when I think about how Clarindans and Iowans would react to Japanese soldiers being housed here, you can imagine that it was not the same kind of response that the Germans received. As a matter of fact, and this is a confusing part of this story, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt issued an executive order rounding up Japanese American citizens on the West Coast and put them in internment camps. This was an executive order that All Japanese Americans, first and second generation Japanese American citizens and immigrants, were put in detention centers, places like Manzanar. And the Japanese who were at Camp Clarinda are not Japanese American citizens. They are Japanese soldiers. But that gives you a sense of how we, as a country, viewed the Japanese. We were concerned that the Japanese American citizens on the West Coast would collaborate with the Japanese. And we were concerned that they might destroy and hinder our weapons facilities that were in operation on the West Coast. And so as a matter of fact, and this isn't, let me add to the complexity of the story. The Japanese did not sign the Geneva Convention, and the Japanese did not agree to treat prisoners of war well. The Japanese, culturally, as you probably are aware, believed that if you surrendered, you dishonored your family and you were dead to your family. We took fewer than 10,000 Japanese soldiers prisoner. We took more than 375,000 Germans prisoner because the Japanese refused to surrender. In that combat on those volcanic islands in the South Pacific, the Japanese refused to surrender. They fought to the death. They believed that if they surrendered, then they were dead to their family. And so the Japanese, as a result, they treated American POWs horrifically. They tortured them, they starved them, and they executed them because they believed that they were dead to their families. And so these are all some of the attitudes that Iowans had in the back of their mind when they found out that Japanese POWs were coming to Iowa. Just as a side note, American citizens of Japanese descent who were put in those detention centers could get out of the detention centers if they went to college. And so 5 Japanese Americans went to Simpson College in 1944 and 1945 because they were able to get out of a detention center to go to college. And there were other Japanese Americans who went to Iowa State as well. Okay, I'm in the home stretch. And then you can ask me questions. When the Japanese came to Clarinda, farmers refused to utilize them. In the spring of 1945, in February, there was an emergency meeting where farmers said, we need help, but we're not using them. And so the short-term solution was to ship about 300 German POWs from Algona back to Ottawa, Iowa. And they created a branch camp there, and about those 300 German POWs were going to be support for the early spring planting season. Now, the farm season in Algona and Kasuth County in 1945 went on just like 1944 without a hitch and was very successful. But we were on the verge of not having a successful farm labor season in southwestern Iowa because we needed that farm labor and farmers refused to use Japanese POWs. There were some stereotypes about the Japanese. They thought that they wouldn't work hard. They thought that they would be lazy. They thought that they wouldn't be compliant. And they did not want to work with them. The Supreme Commander of the 7th Service Command contacted Lieutenant Colonel George Ball, who was the camp commander at Camp Clarinda, and he said, I want the Japanese working. In fact, he said, I want them working like piss ants, is what he said. I think that means working pretty hard. And so Lieutenant Colonel Ball tried to convince local farmers to use Japanese POWs. The first time this happened was in March of 1945, and a group of Japanese POWs was hired to work on a farm near Tarkio Township, which is right between Shenandoah and Clarinda. The farmer's name was Elmer Hodson, and the POWs were going to shuck corn. And when the German POWs worked, they got paid 80 cents a day, no matter how much work they did. But because the camp officers did not believe the Japanese would work hard, they said, we're not going to pay them 80 cents to do nothing. We're going to pay them by the bushel. I'm setting this up for you. I'm almost done. I'm in the home stretch. On March 29, 1945, a Japanese leader with little or no experience picking corn took charge of a group employed on the Hodson's farm. The Japanese laborers worked at such a rapid pace the American guards assumed they would quickly wear out. After the 8-hour day had ended, however, the POWs were still going strong. A dozen Japanese POWs shucked 700 bushels of corn the first day, averaging 53 bushels per man. And a bushel is about 112 ears of corn, so that's about 5,800 ears of corn that they're shucking by hand. According to Lieutenant Colonel Ball, referring to the work done on the Hodson farm, the first time we took we used the task rate. We took a dozen of these men over to a farmer to help him shuck corn. We had it figured out that they could get no more than 50 or 60 cents a corn husk in their 8 hours. But can you imagine it? The men averaged between 52 and 53 bushels of corn that day. They finished up the day with more than $1 apiece. We had to make some changes after that. Ultimately, now there were never more than 1,000 Japanese POWs at Camp Clarinda, whereas there were 2,500, almost 3,000 German POWs at Clarinda when it was at its height of its operation. So there were never as many Japanese POWs, but early successes of using Japanese POW labor encouraged other farmers to use Japanese POW labor. And not only other farmers, what I didn't know until I went to Clarinda was that Page and Fremont County, those two counties had more acreage devoted to nurseries than any two counties in the country. They were growing table grapes. They were growing asparagus. They were growing crops that had to be harvested by hand. Not machines, but by hand. And so Earl May Nursery employed dozens of Japanese POWs, and those POWs worked exceptionally well for them. There was a negative response. This is from the Shenandoah Evening Sentinel. It says, quote, "These arrogant peoples inspire me to a deep hatred. I would have little compunction in shooting them. They stand for everything I hate." This is, I forgot to click my slides. This is the story of those Japanese POWs who worked on the Hodson farm. Between May and August of 1945, 9,609 man days of labor, 8-hour work days of Japanese labor was performed in Page and Fremont County. This is a quote from the Clarinda Herald-Journal. It says, "Japs being notably expert at horticulture, some of these Jap prisoners were quickly contracted to help ease a shortage in the busy nurseries at Shenandoah. They were assigned apple tree slip planting. Tying burlap around their knees, they went right to work, and the foremen say they are doing more and better work than the former German prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel Reed suggests that this may be natural due to their experience planting rice." A number of the Japanese POWs did have experience in rice cultivation. So in 1945, the moral of the story is that farmers eventually did utilize Japanese POWs, and the farm labor program in 45 was incredibly successful as a result of it. Fremont County Farm Labor Office placed 7,407 workers with 320 farmers, which made $70,000 for the government. Fremont County, between March and November, used 121,000 man-hours of POW labor. They harvested peas, put up hay, cut weeds out of corn, hauled manure, fed cattle, which is cattle, built fence, and cut 199,000 pounds of asparagus. The Herald-Journal reported that in Page and Fremont counties, prisoner war labor was a lifesaver for farmers this past season. Many farmers would not have been run without their help. This is a photograph of Japanese POWs at Camp Clarinda. It's the only photograph that I am aware of that depicts the Japanese soldiers at the camp. Okay. In May of 1945, Germany is defeated and surrenders, and the war ends in Europe. In August of 1945, we drop the atomic bombs, and Japan surrenders, and the war ends. The camps don't immediately close because this takes time. By January of 1946, there were still POWs at Camp Clarinda, but those POWs were being shipped to the West Coast and then would be shipped to Japan. If you wondered, did the POWs have to go back home? They absolutely did. We had what was called mandatory repatriation. The Germans had American POWs. We wanted them back. And so we exchanged American POWs for German POWs as a part of the peace agreement. So all of those German POWs that lived in Iowa during World War II went back to Germany. Did any of them come back to the United States? Absolutely, they did. Many German POWs across the country came back to the United States after the war. One of them was named Rudy Teal. So I taught high school till 2010, and then I taught at Grandview University in Des Moines from 2010 to 2016, and then I've been at Simpson since 2016, which is my alma mater. And when I was at Grandview, I taught with a history professor. His name was Rudy Teal. Rudy was a German soldier who was captured and was housed on the West Coast, or the East Coast, not in Iowa. After the war, he went back to Germany, came to the United States, got a PhD in history, and then taught history at Grandview for 20 years. That was not uncommon. Many German POWs did come back to the United States after the war, but they were required to go home first. This is the final part of the story. Well, number one, if you go to Camp Algona, you're not going to see a camp. You're going to see a museum, but you're not going to see buildings, because when the camps were decommissioned, those buildings were auctioned off. All of those buildings were either moved or taken apart. In Clarinda, there are some concrete slabs where some of those buildings existed, but they're no longer there. If you go to Clarinda, however, there are a couple of small houses in town that were actually officers' quarters at the camp. And when the war ended and the camp was auctioned off, those small homes were moved to from a mile outside of town to town. And when I gave this talk at Clarinda, they pointed out those houses. So there's a couple of houses in Clarinda that were officers' quarters at the camp during the war. Otherwise, you won't see any remnants of the camp. But, interestingly, in the 1980s, a Japanese ball bearing company named NSK comes to Clarinda, and NSK becomes the largest employer of any business in Page County. And it's a Japanese-owned company. And so in my mind, this is not real history, this is Chad's history. In my mind, a Japanese POW who was housed at Camp Clarinda goes back to Japan, and then later on in life comes to the United States and brings his ball bearing plant factory with him and builds that factory in Clarinda, Iowa, and becomes the largest employer of any employer in Page County. I have no evidence to support that. That probably did not happen. However, interestingly enough, it is fascinating to me that one of two communities in the United States of America that had Japanese POWs was Clarinda. And now Clarinda, the largest employer in Clarinda, is a Japanese-owned company. And when NSK opened in the 1980s, they flew the American flag and the Japanese flag at the same height, which is not okay, according to flag protocol. And so they had to lower the Japanese flag so it wasn't as high as the American flag. But there is a Japanese-American presence in Clarinda to this day, and I have no idea if there's any connection between Clarinda's having a Japanese POW camp and NSK. What I do know is that the Germans went home and they talked about and wrote about their story. The Japanese did not. Simpson has a sister school in Japan, and we have Simpson students can study there, and Japanese students can study at Simpson. And a few years ago, I gave this talk over Zoom to Japanese students at this sister college, and they did not know that Japanese men were prisoners in Iowa during World War II. I think that they were humiliated. I think that they did not write books about their story in POW camps, and so those records just aren't there. So I have no idea how Japanese POWs responded in the rest of their lives back in Japan, because those records don't exist. Whereas the German POWs, there are a lot of those stories. A lot of those German soldiers wrote books and they wrote letters, and we've translated those letters. And if you go to Algona, you can read a lot of the letters that German soldiers were writing back and forth to their families, and so on and so forth. I think I need to stop and answer questions that you have.